Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So for today's little sketchbook session, I am going to be drawing my OC Moriko, or I guess in this case we're going to be mostly doing some painting as well as some inking today. I've already got the sketch already laid out because after Saturday's video, I realized I haven't really drawn my OC Moriko like at all recently, and I feel like the other set of my OCs I've pretty much drawn like more or less all this month, so I thought it'd be a good time to draw her. So starting off for my sketch, as you can see, it's already done like pretty much with like a red colored pencil or like mechanical pencil, which is the one that I'm currently using. So the red lead that I'm using for like my little multi-pencil is the Uni Nano Dia Colour in the color red. Then after that, I went ahead and pulled out the watercolors that I'm using, which is the MeiLiang set. And the reason being that I wanted to even use probably watercolors and this combination with this mechanical pencil is that this red color for sketching doesn't really dissolve with the water the same way as the palette color Eno, which I've talked about in the past. So I can really load up on water and just play with watercolors. Now the brushes that I have here, you can kind of see there's a difference between the bristles. One's a little bit more like broom-like, where the bristles are kind of like spreading apart. It's a little bit more blunt, but the other one that I have has more of like a sharp tip. So for the majority of the time when I'm doing like my flats or like the majority of the heavier lifting of the painting where I have to fill in larger areas, I will mostly use the one that looks more like a broom, aka the one on the left side, because I kind of want to be able to fill up the spaces a little bit more easily, and it retains a little bit more water than my other brush that has like a sharper tip. So I think last week I ended up doing a gouache session, and one thing I really wished I did earlier when I was doing kind of like the prepping session before I started to actually use the gouache in my sketchbook is to really plan out colors and kind of work with the watercolors a little bit more so I have a better idea of where I want things to be, which is going to be a little bit similar to what I'm going to be doing today, because I'm going to be really layering up the watercolors to get to my desired colors, I think, for Moriko. So right now I'm going to start off kind of like on the lighter side, and we'll slowly build up a little bit more saturation, a little bit more value slowly. But you can see that the paper in this particular sketchbook, which is a notebook technically, so it does have like that thinner notebook paper, the watercolor doesn't exactly lay on it in a very like smooth way. It's kind of like splotchy and blotchy, so I try my best to not let the water pool too much on her face so that I can kind of remain it a little bit clearer looking compared to like other places. Like I didn't really care if it's like blotched around the neck or the hair or like let's say the hands and stuff. And for the most part, whenever I use like watercolor in like on top of this particular paper, I'm not too hung up on the fact that, you know, I want things to look super smooth, so I already know what it's gonna look like for the most part. So usually at the very end of like watercoloring sessions in my sketchbook that kind of looks like this, so the lines aren't really super dark or anything, I will go back in later and do some line art on top. So technically the way that I'm working right now is not the way that I typically work with the watercolor in my sketchbook. I have a lot of fun doing like simple graphite drawing of like a character or something, doing some lighter washes typically, and then after that I will go back in with like a black ballpoint pen and like slowly build out and flesh out the line art again and kind of make things look a little bit more clean and clear, but also having that contrast with the lines and the softer colors work out really well. So this time we won't be using the ballpoint pen for line art. I'm going to choose something a little bit more bold. So Moriko has a lot of darker areas because of her jacket being black, and her hair is kind of like on the black green side for the most part. So to make sure that things stand out properly, I will be choosing a kind of like a pen that will have a little bit more higher contrast, and it's just kind of like pens that I really want to fiddle around with again because I really enjoyed them and I've definitely talked about them. So I'll probably will talk a little bit more about the pens and stuff I want to try out with them maybe in the future, but that'll be a little bit later in this video. So for now we're just going to continue to add more washes and colors to my sketches of Moriko. So for Moriko, I did struggle a little bit with trying to think of what I wanted to do for like a little mini spread, but because I haven't drawn her all that much recently, I do think like all three doodles technically all look like a different person. Like their facial, it's like mostly their eyes, I feel like, and maybe just their face shape. It's not really consistent among all three of them, so I did wish that maybe I spent a little bit more time sketching them out before I started to paint them. But kind of like for anything in my sketchbook generally, I don't want to be too precious with them, and I feel like that's like a slight downfall for me when it comes to doing like gouache painting. It's because I tend to abandon them quite quickly. But I think maybe next week, if I have time, I'll try my best to do another gouache session, but I will do a lot more planning in terms of working with watercolor as a good base for myself, and then layering up the watercolor slowly again, and hopefully being a little bit more careful with my layering and not getting too hasty and applying such thick layers and then struggling later. But not only that, I think I will try my best to figure out like who I want to draw, and I want it to be like something fan art related, just because maybe if it's my own OCs, I do tend to give up a little bit earlier because like I don't really care as much what it looks like, if that makes sense. But if I have something like I have to reference, so let's say if I drew Venti, I will try my best to make sure that they look like Venti in the end, regardless if I do end up like making it look more finished or if I leave it a little bit unfinished, like around the edges and stuff. I think majority of my favorite paintings done with gouache, none of them typically are of my OCs, unless I'm like misremembering a gouache painting that I have. But for the most part, I think the other ones are all fan art. Like I've done one of Wanu, I've done one of Eki, which is like of Ike Eveland. I think I've done one of Albin. I think I have one of Kaya as well. So yeah. But enough about gouache, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the inking, line art, and the pens that I'm going to be using today. So there's not really a specific brand on this particular pen, and it does come in like a little set. I did receive it as a gift, and I believe it was bought off of an Asian website, so I'm not too sure where exactly it came from. But it comes in like a pack of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6 pens, and 3 of them are like brush pens, and the other 3 is a extra fine, a fine, and a medium size nib. But the nibs for these are not exactly like your typical fine liners, nor are they exactly like brush pens. So they are labeled as like a calligraphy pen, and they are refillable at the back, so I might have to look into how to refill these properly or to find like proper ink to put in them, because I don't want to really accidentally screw up like the tips of them or like the nibs. But for the 3, which is like extra fine, fine, and medium, the tips of them look a little bit more like solid. The ones for the brush pens typically are a little bit more softer and kind of looks like a typical brush pen for like water-based markers. I believe it's more like felt based in terms of like the nib material. But the other ones that I have, let me grab one really quick. It kind of has like a firmer nib. It almost has like a gray base, and then it transitions into kind of like a harder, I guess it's not harder. I think like the gray little base closer to like the actual pen barrel is more of a hard material, but where it dispenses kind of like the ink almost has like a squishier, firmer material. It's not quite like super hard or like super squishy, let's say like the felt for the brush pens. So it does allow me to use the very tip of it to get some finer lines, but if I squish down on the nib, I can get a little bit of variation, which is definitely helpful for people who probably do calligraphy and know how to do like hand lettering. But for me, I find it easier to use when I'm doing larger areas of inking and stuff, because I will be able to use pretty much just the one pen probably for a good portion of the inking. Later on, when I'm working on Moriko's like jacket and stuff, I will be using the brush pen instead of like the other 3 nibs, because I want to fill in the larger areas much more quickly. But you can see like on some areas like where Moriko's neck, I'm also just realizing how awkward her neck looks like connected to her head, so please ignore that. But there is a little bit of like line width variation amongst the lines, and sometimes I do manually go back in to like thicken and put kind of more emphasis on the the depths or like the line width variation within my lines, but some areas for these particular drawings I do intentionally press down a little bit harder if I want thicker lines, and I do want to get better at that. I think it'll help me also like when I'm working digitally to have a little bit more confidence when I'm doing line work, so I don't have to, you know, be a little bit too particular about always using such a small brush and then having to do thicker lines in certain places. I've seen like, I forget when this was exactly. I think there was an artist I really liked during my middle school to high school days. I think her name was like Haru Katsune at the time. So she had a very large brush size, but I think she was so light-handed and had such good like pressure sensitivity with her device that she used such a large brush, but she would use only the tip of it in color. But like looking at the screen, sometimes like digital programs allow you to show like amongst like hovering with a brush, it shows as like a little cursor or like a size of the brush, like maybe depicted as a circle or a square or whatever the shape material is for your brush. And hers is like huge, but then the little areas you can see her coloring and doing line art were like super tiny. So that amount of control would be amazing to have, but I definitely need to like build my way up slowly to that and have a little bit more confidence in working with line art in general. But I hope you can tell kind of like where the contrast I wanted to have compared to like, let's say Moriko's jacket or her hair. Because her hair, I did end up putting a lot more of like the darker values on certain sides of Moriko's hair, especially on like the larger drawing I did on the left hand side. The ballpoint pen probably would not have shown up, and if anything it would have been a little bit annoying because the ballpoint pen typically has a little bit of that almost like a glare if it catches the light, and watercolor on this notebook paper, and I think watercolor more or less in general kind of has like a matte finish, so it would have been a little bit more distracting and probably very hard for me to work with in terms of kind of like inking, because I do have like two artificial lights on the left and the right hand side of my drawing station. And because of that, sometimes the glare is really bad and I actually can't see where any of my lines are because it's getting hit by the light. But with these like calligraphy pens, there is a little bit of a sheen, but it's not super drastic, similar to like, I guess, graphite or using like the ballpoint pen. So it was much more easier for me to do the inking process and still like be able to see like the little matte blackish areas that I was able to fill in for her hair, her jacket, her pants and stuff. So it worked out better this way, and I'm glad I did not end up using the ballpoint pens. I definitely think like if I ended up doing the method that I used to do for previous doodles where I would draw in graphite, do very light washes, and then go back in with the ballpoint pen, the ballpoint pen kind of like meshes well with my leftover graphite sketch that kind of remains. But with something like this where you can't even really see like a lot of the red sketch anymore, I don't really mind or like feel the need to kind of like match my ballpoint pen to like my pencil sketch lines, if that makes sense. Also, while I'm doing the inking, this might be a little bit off topic. I am like 100% sure that I've talked about this when I first got my webcam, I think, and I was doing more traditional videos, was that every time like my hand enters and exits the frame of my camera, the lighting kind of like shifts, and I was not sure what was causing that for a long time. I turned off one setting and finally it's back to normal again. I don't know what happened and I don't know why that setting was turned on again. It basically had like a backlight compensation, and I think it was either on or off. I just did the opposite and now my light is stable again, so that's great. So whenever I do time lapses, it won't be like flashing on the screen anymore. But with the inking more or less done, I decided to add kind of like a few extra things on the spread, which I kind of regret. So I went on 1001 fonts to look for some kind of like cursive writing that looked kind of nice. Now, I don't usually dislike my handwriting if I kind of manually do the lettering and filling it in like slowly one by one, but I decided to take a crack at trying to do it more like hand lettering and do it all in one. But I was having like a hesitation between like if I wanted my upstrokes or my downstrokes to be thin or thick. I think typically it's thin strokes going up and then thicker strokes when you're going down for lettering. So I should have kept that in mind instead. But I guess that takes us to the end of today's video. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching this little session, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!